You have a voice in your head that narrates everything. What you are, what you deserve, what must happen next. It says, I'm the one in charge. And it feels so intimate that you mistake it for you. But here's the paradox. The more faithfully you obey that voice, the smaller your life becomes. Because the I you defend is not a living self. It's a story made of labels, wounds, victories, and fear. Across the hidden traditions of Western mysticism, there is a phase of inner alchemy with a brutal name, Mortificatio, the making dead. Not a morbid obsession, not self-hatred, but a method. A controlled collapse of the false center so something deeper can breathe again. If that sounds extreme, good. Real transformation always sounds dangerous before it becomes obvious. Tonight we are going to walk through this mystery the way the old initiates did, as a psychological operation disguised as spiritual poetry. And by the end, you will recognize the subtle prison you've been calling your identity. In the medieval manuals of alchemy, Mortificatio appears inside the nigredo, the blackening. The texts speak of decay, ash, decomposition. But the language is symbolic. The old adepts weren't only refining metals in furnaces. They were describing what happens when the psyche is forced to outgrow its own defenses. A Swiss depth psychologist and historian of myths, let's call her Dr. Marianne Vogt, treated these images with unusual seriousness. She argued that the ego is not evil. It is necessary. A child needs a strong I to survive, to separate, to learn the rules of the world. The problem is what happens later. That early survival structure becomes a permanent regime. The ego wants continuity. It wants certainty. It will defend its identity the way a kingdom defends its borders. Not because it is wise, but because it is afraid. And when you confuse that fear with truth, you live inside a narrative that cannot evolve. Mortificatio begins the moment the ego discovers something shocking. It is not the whole of you. In Jungian language, the ego is the center of conscious awareness, the part of you that chooses, plans, compares, judges. But Jung insisted there is a larger reality behind it. The self. Not your personality, not your social mask, but the total pattern of your being. Conscious and unconscious together. The ego thinks it is the monarch of the inner world. In truth, it's more like a gatekeeper. It manages traffic. It tells you what's acceptable, what's safe to feel, what's safe to feel. It edits your life into a clean story you can present to others and to yourself. And here is the cost. Whatever does not fit the ego's story gets pushed down. Desire, grief, rage, tenderness, intuition, contradiction. That discarded material does vanish. It becomes the shadow. It gathers force. It waits. And sooner or later it returns, usually as suffering, obsession, projection, or collapse. Mortificatio is the process where the ego's rule is broken. Not to destroy consciousness, but to restore it to a deeper center. The mistake most people make is thinking ego death is an idea you can adopt, as if you could read one mystical quote and suddenly transcend the self. But the ego does not surrender because you understood a concept. It survives through concepts. It can turn spirituality into another identity, the awakened one, the chosen one, the pure one. Mortificatio does happen through a clever conclusion. It happens through pressure, through experiences that your old self cannot digest, moments when your usual strategies fail, the charm that no longer works, the plan that collapses, the relationship that exposes you, the success that tastes empty. This is why the alchemists spoke in violent metaphors: calcination, dissolution, separation. Because the ego experiences transformation as a threat. When your protected identity begins to crack, it feels like death. But the deeper truth is strange. What dies is tattoo. What dies is the claim that you are only that story. And once that claim weakens, something else becomes possible. An inner life not ruled by defense. The core engine of Mortificatio is a principle most modern minds resist. Crisis is not the enemy of growth. Crisis is the door. Not because pain is holy, and not because suffering makes you superior, but because consciousness evolves by abandoning structures that can no longer hold reality. Think of a snake shedding its skin. The old skin once protected it. But if it refuses to molt, it suffocates inside what used to keep it safe. Dr. Vogt described this as the psyche, hidden intelligence. Something inside you is always trying to mature you, even when your ego begs for comfort. And when you want change voluntarily, life applies pressure. The unconscious arranges encounters. It forces contradictions to the surface. It creates situations that expose your blind spots. This is why Mortificatio can feel like betrayal. You thought yourself wanted stability, but your deeper being wants truth. And truth requires a kind of humiliation, not shame, but the dismantling of arrogance. The ego must learn, I cannot control everything. I am not entitled to certainty. I do not command the universe. That recognition is the first crack where freedom enters. Traditions that speak openly about Mortificatio share one uncomfortable requirement. You must participate. Not passively endure, but consciously cooperate with the dismantling of your false identity. This is the point where the path becomes inverted. Instead of chasing what the ego craves, approval, control, superiority, you begin to welcome what the ego fears: uncertainty, exposure, failure, rejection, powerlessness. Not because these things are good, but because they reveal what is real when your defenses can perform. There is a critical difference here. Neurotic self-punishment is the ego attacking itself, trying to regain control through self-hatred. Mortificatio is not that. It is the ego learning to step aside without violence. It is the end of the ego's tyranny, not the destruction of your humanity. You stop asking, how can I win? And begin asking, what is trying to be born in me? Because the true enemy is not pain. The enemy is the ego's addiction to remaining unchanged. And once you see that, your suffering changes shape. It becomes instruction. The first recognizable phase of Mortificatio is the shattering of certainty. It begins when your identity, your internal resume, stops protecting you. Sometimes it's dramatic, a loss that cannot be negotiated, the death of someone you leaned on, a sudden illness, a collapse of status, a betrayal that exposes your illusions. But often it's quieter. The slow realization that your life, even when successful, doesn't feel alive. The ego is built on assumptions. I know who I am. I know how life works. I know what guarantees safety. Mortificatio begins when these assumptions break. This is frequently when the shadow appears. Jung described the shadow as the rejected part of the psyche, what you deny, hide, or disown. Under pressure, it rises. You catch yourself acting against your self-image. You discover envy, cruelty, obsession, weakness, things you swore weren't you. And the ego panics. It tries to rebuild the mask fast, to restore a clean narrative. But the alchemical texts call this stage blackening for a reason. The psyche becomes murky, ambiguous, contradictory. No easy story survives. This is where most people turn back. If you don't run from the blackening, the next phase arrives. Authentic despair. Not ordinary sadness. Not the depression that comes from disappointment. This is deeper, existential. A confrontation with the possibility that life owes you nothing, that meaning is not guaranteed, that death will take everything you grasp. The ego has spent your whole life performing a quiet magic trick, pretending that the world is stable enough to be controlled. Authentic despair is when the trick fails. In this state, the mind grows brutally clear. You see the futility of ambition. You see how fragile love can be. You see how the strongest person still breaks, and your old motivations lose power. This is dangerous territory. Some try to escape through numbness, addiction, distraction. Others fall into self-destruction. The ancient texts describe this as standing at the edge of annihilation, not only physical death, but psychological fragmentation. And yet, this despair contains a hidden gift. Because when the ego's fantasies collapse, something more honest begins to surface. The ego feared that beneath its narratives was nothingness. But Mortificatio reveals something stranger. Beneath the ego is not emptiness, but depth. The third phase is the one the ego hates most, the dissolution of personal will. After enough struggle, the individual realizes, I cannot force my way out of this. At first, this feels humiliating. Your strategies stop working. Your mind can think its way to peace. Your willpower can push reality back into shape. And the ego interprets this as weakness. But something unexpected happens when the fight becomes unsustainable. The grip loosens. You begin to sense forces inside you that do not belong to the ego's command. Currents of intuition, strange insights that arrive uninvited, creative impulses that don't ask permission, emotional truths that refuse suppression. In esoteric Christianity, this resembles the moment when the disciple stops bargaining with God and finally surrenders. In Gnostic language, it is the collapse of the false ruler, the archon within, so that a higher intelligence can speak. Dr. de Vogt described this shift as the rebirth of receptivity. The psyche stops trying to dominate reality and starts listening to it. Instead of demanding certainty, you develop the courage to be changed. Not resignation, not passivity, but alignment with what is real. This is where Mortificatio begins to reveal its secret. You survive the collapse. You discover that even when your identity falls apart, awareness remains. The fourth phase is the recognition of deeper identity. The ego expected annihilation. But instead, the inner world grows clearer. Less noise, less commentary, less self-interrogation. And within that silence something appears, not as a thought, but as a presence. Jung called it the self, the organizing center beneath the ego. Mystics called it the divine spark. The alchemists called it the hidden gold. It feels like discovering you were never the frantic voice. You were the one who heard it. This is why ego death is not nihilistic. It's the opposite. The ego dies as ruler, and consciousness becomes wider, more spacious, more connected to life itself. And with that comes a terrifying responsibility. If you are not your old identity, then you cannot live by its excuses anymore. You cannot blame your limitations on your story. You must begin to live from a deeper will. Not, what do I want? But what wants to emerge through me? This is where the inner work becomes real. But Mortificatio does not end with revelation. It ends with reconstruction. The fifth phase is a rebuilt ego, now in service. the ego does disappear. It becomes what it always should have been, a tool, not a throne. The old ego demanded control because it believed survival depended on dominance. The reconstructed ego learns a different strength, the ability to act without gripping. Medieval writers called this holy indifference, not apathy, but the freedom to move through life without being enslaved by outcomes. You still make plans. You still speak, choose, build, protect what matters. But there is less panic underneath, less desperation to prove yourself, less need to win every moment. And this is the paradox. The person who releases ego obsession often becomes more effective because they are no longer fighting reality. They respond to what is there, not what their pride demands. This is the whitening stage of inner alchemy, purification, not of morality, but of motivation. Your actions become cleaner because they come from truth rather than compensation. You don't become perfect. You become real. And yet, there is a part of Mortificatio most writers soften because it terrifies the reader. The crisis point. The moment the ego reaches the absolute edge of its strength and reality feels empty. Mystics called it the dark night of the soul, not poetic sadness, but an experience where consolation disappears. Prayer becomes dry. Meaning feels artificial. The world turns flat, unreal, almost hostile. Sleep breaks. The simplest tasks become heavy. Your mind circles the same unbearable questions. Dr. Vold warned that this passage can resemble a psychiatric collapse. The personality deconstructs faster than it can rebuild. Strange dreams intensify. Buried memories rise. Archetypal forces, voices, symbols, inner presences begin to feel autonomous, as if the psyche is no longer roars. This is where discernment matters. Some breakdowns are destructive. Others are birth pains. The difference is not drama, but integration. Do you slowly regain relationship with reality, or do you lose it completely? Mortificatio is not recklessness. It is transformation held inside a container. Reflection, grounding, and sometimes help. In that crisis, the ego's greatest temptation is to escape, to end the discomfort by rebuilding the old identity, even if it is false, to choose numbness over truth. But the strange thing is, even in the darkest collapse, something persists. A thin thread of awareness. A quiet witness that remains when everything else is shaking. And for many, that becomes the first real faith of their life. Not belief in a doctrine, but trust in existence itself. The old self wanted guarantees. The deeper self asks for honesty. This is why the ancient initiates framed Mortificatio as an initiation rather than a tragedy. When you cannot rely on control, you begin to develop a new kind of strength, the ability to endure reality without distortion. You learn that you can feel terror without becoming it. You can face meaninglessness without worshiping it. You can meet uncertainty without collapsing into panic. In Christian symbolism, this resembles the crucifixion, not only of the body, but of the ego's demand to be the center of the story. In alchemy, it is the moment the substance finally breaks down, so the hidden essence can be released. What is killed becomes whole. When someone passes through Mortificatio, the transformation is not always visible from the outside. They may keep the same job, the same relationships, the same daily routines. But internally, the center of gravity shifts. The ego stops shouting commands from the throne. It moves to the edge. A new humility appears, not the fake humility of self-abasement, but the sober recognition of scale. You are not the universe. You are a wave in it. And that is not depressing. It is liberating. because the endless labor of defending an inflated identity finally relaxes. In its place, a different confidence emerges. Not the brittle confidence of always being right, but the existential confidence of having faced chaos and discovered you can survive it. You become more flexible, more perceptive, less trapped by rigid beliefs. And perhaps most importantly, you become capable of real love. The defended ego calculates everything: threat or reward, status or loss. But love requires a small death, the surrender of the self-image so the other can be seen as they are. Mortificatio creates that space. It makes relationship possible, not as control, but as encounter. You still suffer. You still fail. But the suffering is no longer proof of personal tragedy. It becomes part of the larger unfolding. And this is the final teaching the old alchemists hid inside their paradoxes. The death of the ego is not loss. It is revelation. What dissolves is not your awareness, but the illusion that awareness belongs to your story. What collapses is not meaning, but the ego's monopoly on meaning. The inner gold was never created through conquest, accumulation, or domination. It was uncovered when the false center burned away, when the psyche stopped screaming for control, when you finally saw the cage you called me. Mortificatio does not ask you to destroy yourself. It asks you to stop defending the counterfeit self that suffers endlessly because it believes it must be absolute. And once that illusion weakens, something imperishable stands behind it. A deeper intelligence, a quiet authority, a presence that does not need to perform. This is why the mystics insisted that the narrow gate is real. The needle's eye is not a metaphor for moral effort. It is the collapse of ego inflation. The kingdom is not somewhere else. It is within you. But you cannot enter it as the ruler of your own universe. You enter as what you truly are, a living consciousness, finely aligned with the self.